When the Acadians settled along the shores of the Bay of Fundy in the 17th century, all the way from what we still call the French shore up to the end of Cobequid Bay, they quickly realized they had chosen a hostile environment. Impenetrable woods crowded the shore to the water's edge, almost impossible to clear successfully with their primitive tools. Tides 40 to 50 feet high rolled up the bay and back again twice a day, leaving miles of mudflats at low tide, a waste of water at peak. But these people had dealt with such conditions before. In their part of France, it was customary to dike the shorelands, reclaim the land from the sea, and grow immense crops on the rich alluvial soil they had quite literally created. They used their skills here, and even today the results of their labor more than 300 years ago are still apparent. The early Acadian dikes have been superseded by more modern structures, but the principles remain the same. To give some idea of how the Acadians tamed the Fundy tides, Parks Canada commissioned artist Lewis Parker to recreate the 17th century scene. Terry Shaw was the Parks Canada interpretation officer who worked with Lewis Parker. Well, it was one thing to decide that the scene must be shown, but how to go about it? The dikes the Acadians built either no longer exist or they lie buried under new dikes, many of them rebuilt in this 20th century, still holding back the waters of the Fundy so that the land can be used. Written records from Acadian times are rare. They disappeared with the dispersal of the Acadians in 1755. I asked Terry where they got the information they needed to do the illustration.
Well, I think this is a rather interesting painting because there is nothing in existence that we know of that attempts to show this process, show this activity carried on by the Acadians while they were in Nova Scotia, settled around the Bay of Fundy area. So we're really, and there's very, very little in the way of historical information on it. There are very few records that survive from the Acadian period.
And I would suspect very little left of the original dikes.
Very little left. I think there may be some remnants left, but even that's open to debate. Because all of the land, or much of the land that was originally reclaimed is still being used. And the old dikes have been, in most cases, superseded by more recent dikes.
So how did you find out how these abattoirs, or aboiteaux, is it?
Aboiteaux, that's correct. The aboiteaux is the sluice way to distinguish that from the dike itself. The purpose of the aboiteaux is to allow, once the dike is in position, to allow drainage to occur from the land that was formerly flooded by the tide. But when the tide comes up, the aboiteaux has a valve, a one-way valve, which will close and prevent the seawater from coming back in onto the old marshland.
So it was really the key to the successful dike.
That's correct, it was.
Now you work with Lou very closely in order to get these details right. Can you go through the process a little bit?
Okay, in this case, as I mentioned, there's very little academic information available in the historical literature on this process. There are a couple of eyewitness accounts, but they're very sketchy and they're very ambiguous in their interpretation. So in this case, it wasn't enough to just go to the historians to find out what was in the record. We went to people who had practical experience in dike building in this century. And we went to three gentlemen that have had a lot of experience, a lifetime of experience. All three of these gentlemen are now retired. And we sought these people out, people who have worked in the building of dikes in this century, who have made a study of dike practices, and who are as qualified as anybody to tell us the most likely way that the Acadians would have built their dikes.
So that the same methods you think were used more recently that the Acadians used back then?
The same principles, certainly, have been used more recently.
The principle of the key itself in which they sank the dike?
Well, essentially, yeah, the essential principle of the mud dike, which is faced with sods that are specially cut to create a remarkably steep slope and still hold together over decades. The sods are faced so that the marsh grass continues to grow on the outside and knit the whole thing together. And of course, the principle of the abateau is still used today. If you go out to the Grand Pré Marsh, you'll see much larger abateau now in use, metal ones that have been put in this century. But the principle is exactly the same as the Acadians practiced back in the 18th century.
When we began, you were talking about the particular problem you face with the reflection of the water off the mud at different portions of the dike, where the mud would be wetter, for example, and where it might be drier. Are there any other problems? I suppose there are other problems that you face in this incredibly complex thing.
Well, there's a problem of I'll talk about the color in it.
Okay.
The problem of the trying to keep an overall balance. We've decided to keep the sun behind a cloud. That's why we've got some cirrocumulus clouds in the background, which will shade the whole area. Well, if we do that, there's actually, because of the blue of the sky coming through the clouds, there's actually more blue reflected in the clay. We're trying to determine. Well, right now I can't think of the figures or anything else. All I can think of is how we're going to show the realities of the different levels, the different perspectives. There's clay at this level, but the light that's reflected most is along the river bank and down the face of this almost pyramid and that side there. And until I get that resolved, I really can't think of what we're going to do back here. There's very little clay showing back there anyway.
So all the clay that goes into the dike is dug up from the marsh itself. You can see up here, although it's not finished, but they're still spading here to dig up sods to put on the face of the dike. The main dike material is dug out from a trench here and brought in from other parts of the marsh. It's all wet mud, wet clay. And Lou's problem is to get that sense of the wetness in the mud. In the mud, it's a very dense mud, has a very specific color coming from this particular marsh, and as he mentioned, it will change from down here where it's glistening with water to up here where it's been dug up, piled in a big pile, or put into the dike, and it will start to perhaps dry out somewhat. And all this will cause a difference in the appearance of the mud. So it's quite a subtle problem.
There are things in this picture which confuse me, I must admit. I had no idea, for example, that these dikes were made with what looked like green leaf twigs fitted around the abateau and up the slopes of the stream.
Well, this is a mistake we made in the first linears. We developed the first linears without the knowledge that there was a substructure around the abateau which would keep the dike from being washed away in the first tide.
That would be a major mistake, I guess, if it had been left
well,
that way.
again, this is a case of where we have no specific historical information on this point. We knew generally that the abateau was placed in this shallow stream bed where there's natural drainage, and we know that there's basically a mud dam build-up and incorporated into the dike. But it's only when you talk to people who've actually built dikes, have actually installed abateau in this kind of situation, that you become aware of the practical problems involved. And in this case, as we were told, this mud is very slippery. There has to be some way of essentially locking this structure in position so that it won't slide.
You have to bind it in.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do, as far as we know, to the best of our knowledge, the most likely way they would have done that is to put a brush mat made of spruce trees in the stream bed, hold it down with branches and stake it very firmly into the mud to provide essentially friction, and then place the abateau on top of that and start building your mud structure up from there. And this structure itself, the dam, the same principle applies, that layers and layers of brush are interleaved as the dam is built up to essentially knit the whole thing together.
More about the problems of recreating one small piece of the 17th century right after these messages.
May I suggest something here? Because what we're looking at now is the beginning of the color work on the final painting, but there are stages that you have gone through which will have settled some of these points long before you got to the business of laying color in. Could we go to some of those earlier stages and discuss those so that perhaps they can illustrate some more of the problems a little more clearly?
Okay.
This is the first of the linears, well, the first of the finished linears that describe the layout of the land based on that one original photograph.
Is it back here? Yeah.
One photograph of the site, the actual site that exists today, of course, without the stream beds.
So you began with a photograph.
That's correct. We went out to the marsh and essentially picked the location that we figured was most appropriate for where the Acadians might have been building a dike and putting in an abattoir back in the 18th century. Of course, this is imaginary. We don't know that they actually did it in this spot, but it's a very likely position. It's all cultivated fields now, but it gives us also a relationship of the village of Grand Pre on the upland, its relationship to the marsh. Back in the 18th century, there was a sizable village of Grand Pre, and the houses were essentially organized along the upland adjacent to the marsh, so they have easy access to the marshland where they grew their crops.
You said the 18th century. Is that when they started building the dikes? Or
Well, actually,
I had the feeling it was even before that.
That's correct, that's correct. As far as we know, the diking practice started probably in the 1630s or 1640s.
So we're really talking 17th century then.
That's correct. Now, Grand Pre wouldn't have been at this stage of development until after the turn of the century, into the 18th century.
All right, Terry, you had the photograph, and you must have come down here to Lou Parker's studio with some ideas of what you wanted him to do.
That's correct.
Well, he had already sent, this is Terry's piece of artwork. We started out with the Grand Pre and with the some of the Beaux Séjours things where Terry sat down and figured exactly that we needed, for instance, in Beaux Séjours, we needed 7 paintings. So he gives me his concepts, which are quite descriptive, you know. All I have
Terry,
to...
I must interject here. I think I prefer Lou's work.
So do I.
but you see, everything's here. It's just had to be refined more. If I didn't have this and the photograph to start with, then I would be making doodles and sketches and sending them to Terry, and he would be going to the authorities who would verify them gradually. But what Terry has already done is contacted the authorities, got a first impression. Yeah, you've done it at that stage,
yes.
all the reference. Got a first impression and sent and said, Lou, this is what I understand it to be. And I say, well, we've got to get a little higher if we're going to show these guys working in the foreground, or we've got to show a little more distance from the horizon down to here so we can show the other side of the dike and show the men working as they are over this side. So I start making little squibbles, which first for the dike construction itself. And that was funny. Remember that day, Terry, where we had to decide what the slope was, that it had to be 5 feet high, but it had to slope that way, and go 6 feet into the down to the riverbed, come back up on this side. So we went through, I don't know, 8 or 10 of these things just to establish the formation of the land as it must have looked before it was all filled in like that.
There's quite a precise geometry, in other words, to this whole structure, and that's why it took us quite a while to work that out. Before we even thought about putting people into it, just to get the geometry established.
And because these fields are still in use, you couldn't do the archaeological work, which the excavations that might have turned up, the evidence of exactly how it was done.
That's correct. As far as I know, there's been no archaeological work done on what I presume to be old Acadian dikes, though I think there's been some inadvertent discoveries of some pieces of wood from old Acadian dikes, but nothing systematic that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go on.
Well, the next stage after establishing this is a confirmation. That wasn't it, by the way. When Terry came down the second to the last time, and we sat down and tried to figure it out, it just wasn't right. And
Can we put that up
Sure.
yeah,
where we can see it?
what happened here just wasn't right, and it had something to do with, well, it had something to do with how far they would have got along before they filled in here, because they knew the tide was coming in. Well, to fill in all that area from here to here, they couldn't have done, presumably, in the time. So we had to bring this over, slope it down to the riverbed, which gave us the angle continued up, which is what eventually led to this resolution here.
And yet that sketch is a very clear representation to me of how they put the sods on the sides of the dike and build up around the abattoir.
Oh, yes, that worked. We have, no sketch or scribble that we make is wasted, because we've learned either negatively or positively towards the finished painting. So,
I just point out one change. This illustrates rather well compared to the present painting. Just move that aside, leave it.
yeah.
In the original sketch, we had the face saws built up on the face of the dam right from the bottom, the bottom where the abattoir was placed. And as one of our consultants pointed out later, since in the stream bed, in the natural conditions, the marsh grass doesn't grow any further down than, say, halfway down the bank. It's asking a lot for sods to actually grow lower down where the ecology is not suitable. So that's a fairly obvious point, and we resolve that by adopting a different method of facing the dike in the lower portion. This is a brush facing, and what they do is they pound stakes down into the mud and pack in brush behind that, and there will probably be one more layer stepped back slightly above that. And once they get that filled up to a certain point, then the sod facing will take over. So that's the kind of change that we make as we go along.
Boy, you become aware of the kind of complexity of detail that you must go into in order to get anything approaching accuracy.
I must mention this, how helpful these were.
One of the fellows fellows that's now retired and has worked all his life on dikes, Mr. Byers from Halifax, and he's a terrific old gentleman, and he provided some initial sketches that were a big help to us in trying to visualize the process. This, for example, here, he's indicating just how the sods were cut with the special diking spade. There's a very precise technique involved here. And secondly, he's showing how these sods are transported. We didn't use the horse. We've gone with the oxen.
He's very good on swayback spavined horses. Isn't he?
He certainly is. This sort of sketch was very helpful to us.
There were details, like at first we had resolved, no, we hadn't resolved, one oxen or two. Would they be pulling a wagon? What size wagon? What kind of yoke? And I don't know at what stage we eliminated the wagons because of the fact that the wheels would bog down in the mud before they got off the shore. But I guess it was from this sketch here that we resolved that
That's right.
it's got to be it had to be a sled. Then could one oxen pull it? And we decided not through the mud. So if it was two oxen, then it had to be double yoked. Well, then how was it? How was the
Connection to the sled.
to the sled?
itself.
How is
We
that
still
made?
don't really know that, so we're trying to hide it.
Well, in some cases, you hate having to hide things, but if there's absolutely no information, then you can't put that no information down. So, of course, we'll build up this pile of spruces, which will disguise exactly how the traces join onto the sled.
What about costumes? This is usually an area where historical research pays off fairly easily because there are lots of records about it. But I'm not so sure about the Acadians with their homemade homespuns.
Well, that's true. The costumes are relatively simple, but we're very fortunate to have the assistance of the people up at Caracat, the Acadian Historic Village, northern New Brunswick. They've done a lot of research on costume. They make their own costumes for their own animation program. In fact, they not only weave their own costumes, but they also dye them. They make their own dyes from local plants and so on. So they have a lot of practical experience now in costume making, and they've been a great help to us on this painting.
You've been talking to Jean Arsenault.
That's right. Yes, she's a tremendous help.
So we had quite a problem in determining how the shirts necked, and they're really very simple, but I couldn't get that for the first number of sketches. I kept wanting to fold the collars down.
Well, we sent a copy of the sketch up to Jean Arsenault, and she sent it back with very precise corrections on the sketch as to how the chemise, the shirt, how the neck was actually made.
This is the village of Grand Pre in the background.
That's right.
And there are buildings in there. Do you have a historical reference on those?
Yes, we do. Again, our major sources here would be Lewisburg. Is really our primary source for 18th century structural information, architectural styles, and that sort of thing. They have provided us with references on the standard type of construction of the period. It's most likely that the piqué style of building, once again, the use of vertical trunks, vertical pieces of wood with clay in between to finish off the wall. Very simple method of architecture and very common at that time.
And is that a sod roof?
That's a sod roof in this photograph. This is from a building at Lewisburg. But we're not showing sod roofs at Grand Pre. Again, our consultants felt that it would be more likely to have a plank roof in this case. Another style of construction, the Charpent style, is shown in this sketch. Actually, this sketch shows both styles. It shows some piqué and it shows Charpent. And that's a fairly typical building of the period. And
With the enclosures at the back?
that's right, with the fenced-in enclosures for livestock, which is very, and small gardens. In Grand Pre, they grew their wheat on the marsh, but most of their vegetables and their that sort of garden produce was grown adjacent to the farmhouses in fenced-in enclosures.
Terry, this, in the photograph that we saw earlier, I think this is it here, it's an open field. That's the point of view. Is this where the final painting is going to be set up?
No, the final painting will be on display at Grand Pre National Historic Park, which is actually what you see in the background here. You see the present church, which is actually a museum at the national park. And as part of our interpretive display, we're going to put this painting out on display overlooking the dike land, and try and give a very brief idea to the visitor of how the Acadians diked the land and how they used it to produce the wheat that they grew in such quantity back in the 18th century.
Well, this is a very much, at this stage, unfinished painting, and we have run out of time. While I thank you both very much for being with us, I'd like to just show one of Lou's earlier works showing the expulsion of the Acadians, because it is finished. The one we see here is a print. And thank you both. It's been fascinating.